The official line that it was an al-Qaeda plot has found itself increasingly challenged since then. A recent poll showed that almost half the US population, that's a high figure, half, believe that there's been a Washington cover-up, and a film dealing with the conspiracy claims is one of the current hottest internet downloads. Plus, a new book says the US government masterminded the attacks and has the duty of Christians to expose the evil at work within the Washington administration. Now, all of that may sound very far-fetched, but the conspiracy theorists have been given added respectability by a sizable number of academics, including the author of this new book, theologian Professor David Ray Griffin. Well, Ed Sturton went to meet him to find out how serious he is about these ideas.
David Griffin, let's deal first with what I think you yourself concede is the main obstacle to believing your theory, which is that to do so, you've got to believe that George Bush is not just a bad president, not just ideologically misguided, and I'm sure you'll find lots of people in Europe who believe those things, but you've got to believe he's actually a monster, somebody capable of countenancing mass murder for political purposes.
Actually, members of the movement are not sure that Bush was involved from the beginning. You know, some people in the movement do put up signs that say Bush knew or Bush did it, but I've never made a statement about that. Now, I have suggested very strongly that it was the Bush-Cheney administration that was involved in this and their Pentagon. So your question still stands, that we have to believe that some of these people in the administration would do a very terrible thing. That is absolutely right.
And it's hard to believe that. I mean, it's such a monstrous thing to do.
But when you look at what people have done for the sake of empire and riches in the past, it is not so hard to believe. People that are good family men have done monstrous things. And we know that from Nazi Germany. These were very cultured, refined gentlemen, many of them, and people could not believe they would be participating in such an event.
All right, let's look in a bit more detail at some of the issues you raise. One of the things you say you believe is that the World Trade Center buildings were brought down not by being struck by the planes, but by explosions, deliberately planted explosions within the buildings. What's the evidence for that?
There are at least 10 characteristics of the way these buildings came down that can be easily explained by the use of explosives, and not a single one of them can be explained without the use of explosives. So the fact that they came down at virtually free fall speed, that there was molten metal under the buildings. Molten metal needs temperatures far exceeding what fire can reach. Furthermore, the buildings came straight down. That's the whole purpose of controlled demolition of the type that we call implosion. There are only a few companies in the world qualified to do it. So the idea that somehow a plane hitting a building plus a fire would cause that building to come straight down. We're talking about over 300 steel columns, 47 core columns, over 200 columns around the perimeter, for the building to come down in a symmetrical way. So the building comes down as you see in the videos. All of those steel columns had to collapse simultaneously. For that to have occurred because of random fires throughout the buildings would be an absolute miracle. Furthermore, there are literally dozens of witnesses who report hearing explosions going off in the towers.
This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents, and you can see the two towers. A huge explosion now raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way!
All right, what about the Pentagon? Why do you think that what hit the Pentagon was not a passenger airliner, but a missile?
I'm not sure it was a missile. I'm just sure it was not Flight 77 under the control of Hani Hanjour. Part of the reason for that is that there is simply no evidence that it was a large airliner. There's no debris, there's no damage that suggests this was by an airliner. They want to say, well, it shattered. What about those steel turbine engines? Did they shatter when they hit the... So there's simply no evidence that it was an airliner.
I mean, if the purpose of the operation was political, as you suggest it was, that would have been perfectly adequately achieved by flying a couple of planes into the World Trade Center, wouldn't it? Why fly a missile into the Pentagon? Why bring the towers down by controlled demolition? What would the point of that be?
This image of the planes hitting the towers, and then the image of the towers coming down, and then the thousands of people who were killed, this was ingrained into the American psyche. And it got the American people ready for revenge, and frankly, many of them didn't care against whom. They wanted revenge, and frankly, against Arab Muslims.
Let's move on to the theology behind some of these ideas. You've got a chapter here in your book called The American Empire, Demonic Evil. What do you mean by that?
That chapter is preceded by a chapter on the historical Jesus, and based on the notion that New Testament scholars have emphasized more recently, that Jesus was preaching an anti-imperial gospel. And of course that makes sense. Palestine was occupied by the Roman Empire, and they were doing horrible things to the Palestinian people. And so the fact that he would be preaching such a gospel of liberation is not a surprise. I suggest then that, that Jesus thought of the Roman Empire as demonic. We can develop a notion of the demonic that's not a mythological notion of a literal Satan, but that there is something that has grown up with civilization over the last 10-some thousand years that we can call demonic power, and that we can see 9/11 as one of the ultimate manifestations of that demonic power.
And faced with that, what is it a Christian's duty to do?
Well, it's if you're a Christian who happens to be a theologian and can write books and get them published, I think it's your duty to write a book and get it published that says just this, and try to call the larger Christian world, call its attention to this, get them to look into the possibility and see if other Christians agree too.
Did you worry at all about the sort of criticism you get in publishing these books and these series, that you'd be accused of being a nutcase?
Oh, the conspiracy theory charge?
Yeah.
Well, the official theory about 9/11 is a conspiracy theory, that 19 members of Al-Qaeda conspired to defeat the most powerful military force in history and to bring down 3 buildings by hitting 2 of them. So it's a conspiracy theory. So anybody who says, well, what you're talking about is conspiracy theory, and we know that conspiracy theories are nutty, they ignore the fact the official theory is a conspiracy theory. So the question is, which of the conspiracy theories is true? And we judge that by which one has the best evidence. And when you look at the evidence for the official theory, it all evaporates.
David Griffin, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you.
Well, a lot of issues to consider in that particular interview, and listening to it with me are, of course, Peter Hitchens and John Irvin, Dean of Coventry. And we're also joined in our London studio by former employee of the British Security Services, David Shayler. Good morning, David, and I'd like to go to you first of all. You're obviously listening to that particular interview. It has been put forward as a nutcase theory, but what's your opinion on it?
Well, I think it's nutcase theory at all. I think if you look at the evidence, Dr. Griffin is absolutely right. There are issues that were not explained by the 9/11 Commission. There was evidence that was not looked at by the 9/11 Commission. But particularly what they've got to answer is how there are hotspots on ground zero taken by a thermal satellite 5 days later. There's no explanation in the official theory about where the energy comes from to create that. But if you take the theory of controlled demolition with the use of the explosive thermite, one of the byproducts of that is molten iron. So clearly this would be the heat from the molten iron still glowing. And that's a very good example, really, of where the official story can't answer the question, but we can with our theory.
But on the other hand, I just made a few notes myself while the film was on. I mean, if you look at the monstrous actions that we've witnessed, and it still spells out as much horror today when you watch the film as it did 5 years ago. But, you know, he talks in a series about those, you know, ingrained images of the towers coming down, conditioning for revenge. I mean, surely that's a very far-fetched theory, that there would be so...
No, I mean, we've actually realised now through historical research that this kind of what we call false flag terrorism is in fact routine. This is not 9/11 is not a new precedent. It's part of foreign policy and so on. And of course that's exactly what it was designed to do. And in fact the Project for the New American Century, a year before 9/11, produced a document called Rebuilding America's Defences. And in that they say they need to control the oil supply and the gas supply across the Middle East. And they say to do that we've got to invade Afghanistan and Iraq. And they say that the American public won't stand for that unless there is a catastrophic and cataclysmic event like a new Pearl Harbor. And we contend that that is the new Pearl Harbor. These neocons are people who've made money from the reconstruction contracts in Iraq and so on. This was quite deliberately designed to inflame American public opinion, to justify adventurism on the part of the Americans in the Middle East.
But